Welcome back to Dead Reckoning, the Human Life Expectancy channel. In this video, we'll explore what might happen to our societies as we live longer. Society will likely change profoundly as a result of increased human life expectancy. As biophysicist Robert Sinsheimer said, quote, "The lifespan of man, the size, the sexuality, the diseases, the hunger, the intellectual range and capacity of man, the simple density of man on this planet. These factors do form and underline our society. And as these change, and the changes have already begun, so must our social structures and our ways of life." Unquote. Well said, Dr. Sinsheimer. We agree, and in this video, we'll discuss potential changes to the global population and to governments. Let's start with population. How will increased HLE affect the global population by 2040? The human population will rise, but probably less than you might expect. The UN projects that the global population will increase 16% from 7.9 billion today to 9.2 billion in 2040, and grow 45% to 11.2 billion by the end of the century. As we studied in prior videos, fertility is also predicted to fall precipitously. However, Wolfgang Lutz, professor of applied systems analysis at the Vienna University of Economics and Business, has highlighted some faults in the UN's approach to forecasting population statistics. He believes that the increased education of women in many countries and increased urbanization will result in further reduced fertility rates, lowering future population projections. The International Institute for Applied Systems and Analysis believes that the human population will be shrinking as early as 2060. He forecasts global human population peaking at just under 10 billion in 2080. However, neither of these estimates explicitly account for potentially increased population from increased HLE due to technologies that we've focused on in these videos. So how big might this impact be? To assess this, let's apply some dead reckoning. And for sake of argument, let's overestimate the potential population increase from technologies. Today, about 57 million people die per year from all causes. This is about 0.8% of the global population. If we assume that all deaths stop immediately, which they clearly would not, and that this lasts for 20 years, standard actuarial calculations show that this would still only increase the global population by about 16% of the current population and an even smaller percentage of the larger forecast population. More realistically, if we assume that human life expectancy increases by 10 years across the population in the next 20 years, the growth would be approximately 8%. However, since the global birth rate is more than double the global death rate, it's 18 per thousand people versus 8 per thousand people for death, changes in birth rates have a much larger impact. Calculations show that every 0.1 unit reduction in total fertility, i.e. from 2.5 to 2.4 births per woman aged 15 to 45, corresponds to a 2.5% reduction in the population over 20 years. This means that a fall in the global fertility rate from 2.5 to 2.2 would largely counteract an 8% increase in population from extended longevity. For comparison, the UN forecasts that the total fertility ratio will fall from today's value of 2.5 births per woman all the way down to 1.9 births per woman by 2100. And even this doesn't take into account the likelihood that fertility will fall even further as HLE increases, as we discussed in our How Will Exponential Population Growth End video. So, while the reduced deaths associated with increasing HLE will increase our population, the impact will be less than you might think and likely more than offset by reductions in fertility. Also, even if this weren't the case, increased population would never be a good reason to avoid extending HLE. Who among us would forego a life-extending medical procedure to avoid contributing to overpopulation? And what government or regulatory authority would suggest that we do so? An individual's right to survive will always trump the objectives of avoiding overpopulation. As a result, reaching a stable population can only be achieved through our fertility, ultimately our choice about how many children we have. In addition to growing, the global population will also continue to age. The UN forecasts that global population will age dramatically by 2100. By 2040, the population pyramid will have changed into a high rise with fewer young people and more old people. If human life expectancy expands by 10 or more years in the next 20 years, this high rise will get even taller and thinner. Through 2040, the majority of population growth is anticipated in people 65 and older. The percentage of people 65 and older has already risen from just over 5% of the global population in 1950 to 9.3% of the population in 2020, and the UN forecasts that it'll become 14.1% of the population by 2040 and 22.5% by 2100. Note that it'll be even higher if fertility falls further than the UN median fertility variant, as we suspect it will. The aging of our population has big implications for healthcare and retirement. In the US and many other countries, newer generations assume the burden of paying for social services and healthcare for older generations. As the population ages, this burden becomes larger and larger. Some have called this a demographic time bomb. As economists say, the aging population results in higher dependency ratios. The dependency ratio, defined as the number of individuals aged 65 and over per 100 people of working age. For OECD countries, it's increased from 13.9 in 1950 and is forecast to be 53.2 by 2050. Said another way, the number of workers supporting each person over 65 is expected to decrease from 7.5 in 1950 to 1.9 in 2050. The US was 7 workers per retiree in 1950, and it's forecast to be just 2.5 workers per retiree in 2050. As a result, Medicare is due to run out of money in 2026, and Social Security will run out of money in 2034. And again, this could be even worse if fertility falls and HLE expands more than the UN expects, as again, we suspect they will. Some countries are aging far more rapidly than others. Today, the average population age varies widely across countries, from Japan with an average age of 45.9 years to Nigeria with an average age of just 15 years. Japan had a dependency ratio of 9.9 in 1950, which works out to 10.1 workers per person over 65, and is forecast to have a dependency ratio of 77.8 in 2050, which is less than 1.3 workers per person over 65. The US sits at just 37.4 years. As HLE extends, this divergence is predicted to grow. We're heading toward a period of heterochronic countries, where some countries' populations grow, such as Nigeria's, and maintain their current population age, while others shrink by more than half and could become dramatically older. This could create new tensions between nations. Those with populations that are rapidly aging and shrinking may resort to ever more desperate means, including military force, to hold on to power. Accordingly, many countries are looking for ways to increase their populations. As we discussed in our How Will Population Growth End video, governments are encouraging couples to have children and fostering immigration. But both are difficult to do, slow to move the needle, and immigration is a zero-sum game across countries, having little to no impact on global population. To defuse this retirement population bomb, many are also looking to increase the age of retirement. This is both the most common and the most logical approach. Retirement programs in most countries were set when HLE was 65 or less. As HLE has grown to 73.4, older people have effectively gotten an extra 8.4 years of support from their governments. Resetting the age when retirement programs kick in would directly solve this problem. However, doing so will be politically treacherous. What politician could expect to get re-elected after denying these significant benefits to older voters, who, by the way, disproportionately show up to vote? There will also likely be another impact on population as we live longer. As we discussed in our Personal Impacts of Living Longer video, it's also possible that humans will evolve rapidly as we select for children or modify our genes. This could impact the balance of genders, affect the diversity of our species, and increase the number of genetically altered people. Surprisingly, unlike the current aberrant trend for parents to select for more boys that we discussed in our Should We Revolutionize Human Reproduction video, the future could well involve preferred selection for girls. The natural sex ratio at birth is approximately 105 males for 100 females. This includes the forced categorization of 2% of births that are gender neutral. This ratio has evolved as what biologists call an environmentally stable strategy over eons to make up for the higher death rate of boys versus girls, so that the sexes more or less are balanced by the age of puberty. This stability has already been upset by sex-selective abortions. The misuse of ultrasound technology has led to ratios as high as 121 boys for every 100 girls born in China, largely as an unintended consequence of the one-child policy that they stopped in 2016, and 108 boys for 100 girls in India. As a result, these countries now have millions of missing women, which properly attracts the ire of many and presents numerous societal problems, including potential upheaval as men come of age in these countries and many are inevitably unable to find mates. In stark contrast, in the future, parents may well select for girls rather than boys. As we covered in our Revolutionizing Human Reproduction video, science now allows us to turn human skin or blood cells into germ cells, which can be transformed into sperm or egg cells. So men might no longer be necessary to create sperm cells. Of course, someone with a functioning uterus would still be required to carry the baby to term. Artificial uterus technology is well behind IVF and PGD. This means that men would no longer be strictly necessary for reproduction and propagation. Of course, this capability is not currently available outside the lab, at least as far as we're aware of. And even if it becomes so, it's not certain that parents will select for more girls. But it's hard to imagine that some parents would not select for the female sex that has all the equipment necessary to reproduce over the male sex that does not. Unfortunately, the future also offers many potential sources of societal conflict as HLE increases. As we've shown, countries with aging populations may have conflict with younger, growing countries. This is the heterochronic issue we referred to. Within countries, there could be increasing struggles between the young and the old. The prospect of increased intergenerational conflict is high as the elderly increasingly hold the reins of power and there are far fewer young people to pay for health care and retirement of the elderly. As we've said, increased gender selection could continue to upset the gender balance. This is already causing millions of men to fail to find mates and who could potentially turn violent. If new technologies eliminate the need for men entirely in their human reproduction, that would have an even greater impact. There could also be struggles between those that have been genetically altered and those that have not. Genetic engineering and advances in reproductive technologies will create people with divergent and potentially superior capabilities. Those without such advantages may fight to maintain their current holds on power. There could also be increased conflict between the rich and the poor. Since people will have more years of peak earnings, the rich might well get richer. The gap between the rich and the poor could increase, causing the poor to rise in protest. However, as we said in our New Ways to Die videos, these conflicts are unlikely to have significant impacts on HLE in the next 20 years. The greatest risk to HLE would be if these conflicts delayed advancements in the medical advances and the new technologies that combat aging. Still, we have to keep a close eye on these as HLE increases. Without concerted effort and action, such conflicts could flare. Let's now move on and explore how living longer will impact our governments. No bones about it. Our governments are failing right now in ways that could bring about not just the reduction of our HLE, but our extinction as a species. Fortunately, as we covered in our New Ways to Die videos, our research suggests that the likelihood of this happening in the next 20 years is low, which is only mildly reassuring. But still, unless we lose our minds entirely or get completely lost in fake news, which we do not believe that we will, see our Evolving Ideas video for more on that, people and societies will become more aware of this fact over time. And this will cause our governments to become more global and better able to represent the needs of all people, including future generations and species. It'll also cause them to increasingly adopt the objective of lengthening HLE and enact policies that will realize it over time. So let's take this step by step. Going back to Dr. Sinsheimer's quote that our social structures and ways of life will need to change, governments must increasingly coordinate globally if we are to maximally extend HLE going forward. As author and philosopher Yuval Noah Harari writes, quote, "We're all living together on a single planet, which is threatened by our own actions. And if you don't have some kind of global cooperation, nationalism is just not the right level to tackle these problems, whether it's climate change or whether it's technological disruption. Or, as Albert Einstein succinctly put it, there's only one path to peace and security, the path of supranational organization. In addition to the increasingly global nature of our communication and commerce, there will be an increasing need for governments to coordinate globally in order to address the 7 existential challenges facing our species. Under human population growth, in the long run, population growth has to come to an end, and we've argued that the current trend toward reduced fertility might bring this to pass. Whether or not this happens, population growth is an existential issue for humanity that cannot be resolved by a single country or group. Under climate change, we must reduce our collective carbon emissions globally in order to address climate change. Under pandemics, since pandemics such as COVID-19 don't respect borders, we must coordinate actions globally and identify and respond to them quickly. Global institutions can best predict, prevent, and manage future pandemics. Under nuclear war, since a single nuclear war could potentially end all life on Earth, all countries have a duty to participate in establishing and maintaining appropriate safeguards. Under natural cataclysms, natural disasters from meteors to supervolcanoes also respect no borders and could potentially end life on Earth. Planning how to avoid or survive such threats is a species-wide concern requiring global coordination. Under food supply transformation, since our food production takes up almost half the planet's land surface, is driving countless species to extinction, is now a primary contributor to obesity, heart disease, cancer, diabetes, and results in the deaths of tens of billions of animals a year, policies and practices that regulate and optimize our food chain are a global concern. And finally, under volitional evolution, genetic engineering and new reproductive technologies give us the power to choose how we and other species will evolve. This decision involves everyone and must be made collectively to ensure we curate life on Earth both wisely and effectively. We're all in the same boat and will sink together if we fail to address these challenges. Our planet simply isn't that big. Catastrophic losses could result from any single country or even individual that either actively or passively allows our population to grow beyond sustainable levels, damages the environment on which we all depend, creates or allows a new pandemic, proliferates or detonates a nuclear device, fails to anticipate or protect us from natural cataclysms, develops food, drugs, or products that reduce our health and life expectancy, alters genomes that harm or even eliminate one or more species. Perhaps complicating global coordination, nations will likely strengthen as HLE increases. As the costs of new life-extending treatments fall below the medical costs of the diseases they cure, governments will increasingly provide these treatments for their citizens. This will expand their role and their power. Also, if we're right that extended HLE will make families less traditional, this will further strengthen the trend toward individualism and require states to provide even more services for their citizens. Fortunately, if futurists Peter Diamandis and Michio Kaku are correct, food, water, energy, and many of the things that we currently pay for will become abundant and much less expensive in the next 20 years. This will make it easier for governments to provide these things, further expanding their power. Still, we suspect and hope that humanity's historical ability to function within communities will have a renaissance, and the current vogue of individualism will wane. Millions of years of evolution have designed us to live and think as community members. However, with the Industrial Revolution, production became less agricultural and family-driven and more driven by manufacturing and service companies that hire individuals. To adjust, governments instituted taxes and provided services for individuals that used to be provided by the family, such as education, law enforcement, and Social Security. As a result, as Yuval Noah Harari writes, quote, "These, together with their active support for the individual, lead to the collapse of the family and the community as they were prior to that time. Within a mere 2 centuries, we've become alienated individuals." Unquote. However, the consequences of individualism are now presenting a clear and present danger to our species. Perhaps not surprisingly, the sum of our individual behaviors hasn't resulted in optimal group behavior. This gives rise to many of the existential issues that can only be addressed at the species level. They'll ultimately require that individualism be balanced by increased coordination of our actions and globalism of our society. This necessary shift will undoubtedly be met with resistance. The recent outbreak of nationalist politicians and politics suggests that this is going to be really difficult. And even proposing strengthening global governance quickly unites the nationalistic patriots of all countries against it. After all, the possibility of losing individualism is one of the central fears of Western society. That's why constitutions for many countries enshrine the rights of individuals. That's also why our culture and media is rife with scary tales of how horrific the loss of individualism can be. Look to Aldous Huxley's Brave New World as one example. Or as another, look to Star Trek New Generation's The Borg, which is a cyborg race that absorbs millions of individuals from multiple species into one collective that thinks and acts with one mind. This is the most terrifying foe and greatest existential risk to all life in that imagined universe. While we've so far been relatively lucky at avoiding the 7 existential risks, our luck will inevitably run out. We can no longer afford to live with these risks in the name of freedom, individualism, or anything else. We believe that people will increasingly require their governments to coordinate globally to address these existential challenges. United we survive, divided we become extinct. It's just that simple. In addition to becoming more global, governments will continue to explore ways to better represent the needs of women, children, minorities, and other species. Democratic societies have the benefit of being responsible to voters, which is an important step in the right direction from autocracies that do not have this duty. However, even in democracies, only those that can vote are represented. In too many countries, this excludes women and minority and others that do not have equal access to voting. Even more so, as the objectives of humanity advance to include species-level existential issues and the rights of other species, see our Humanity's Evolving Objectives video for more on that. We'll have to note that children, future generations, and other species cannot vote on their own behalf and have no direct representation in modern democracies. This makes democracies prone to meet the short-term needs of current generations at the expense of future needs of children, unborn generations, and other species. It's now clear that we've done this. Today's children are increasingly saddled with climate change, reduced fertility, and unprecedented debt, and are beginning to speak out. But the young have the inherent disadvantage of being new to the world without the time, knowledge, and organizations that would enable them to adequately represent themselves. Unfortunately, it's unrealistic to expect that voting populations will adequately represent the needs of children, future generations, and other species. In the US, for example, only 40% of the population are parents, and only 56% of eligible voters voted in the 2020 presidential election. So roughly, that means that we're depending about a fifth of the population to represent the needs of children. Also, today more than 50% of voters are over 50 years old, and this percentage will inevitably climb as societies continue to age. In addition, since fertility is falling globally, it's unrealistic to expect that an aging voting population will adequately represent the needs of children going forward. The current 6th extinction is testament that we are failing any role we might play in curating life and other species on Earth. As animals, individual survival is our first imperative, reproduction our second, followed by the needs of our species and other species a distant third and fourth. Any progressive future and hope for humanity requires that we increasingly understand that this is our natural bias and actively seek to balance it with the needs of future generations and other species. Governments must find ways to represent broader, longer-term needs than those of current voters. Dreaming up future governmental structures is well outside of our expertise. But one could imagine a global government with the percentage of delegates required to represent children based on their percentage of population, and a separate percentage required to represent other species. In the words of John Lennon, "You may call me a dreamer, but I'm not the only one." Finally, since better, longer lives is the implicit promise of all societies, governments will increasingly make this promise explicit by adopting the objective of extending HLE and enacting policies to realize it over time. As philosopher Stephen Cave writes, this will to immortality is the foundation of human achievement. It's the wellspring of religion, the muse of philosophy, the architect of our cities, and the impulse behind the arts. It's embedded in our very nature, and its result is what we know as civilization. More simply, since living longer is our individual prime objective, extending HLE properly belongs among society's guiding objectives. This means adopting the dead reckoning principle of devoting thought, time, effort, and treasure to the things that kill us in proportion to their likelihood of occurrence and our advancing abilities to address them. This, in turn, involves measuring how much is spent to save human lives today across many different approaches. A famous study completed in 1995 calculated the cost per life year saved for 500 life-saving interventions. They found that there's incredible variation in what we're willing to pay to avoid a statistical life year saved, depending upon the context, from 0 to over $10 billion per life year saved. The amounts even varied widely across broad categories. While the median intervention cost $42,000 per life year saved, the median medical intervention cost $19,000 per life year, injury reduction $48,000 per life year, and toxin control a whopping $2,800,000 per life year. Even within categories, there was wide variance. For example, in the category of child safety, the cost per life year saved varied by a factor of 50,000. Flammability standards in upholstered furniture were $300 per life year saved. Influenza vaccines were $1,300. Child-resistant cigarette lighters were $42,000. Child safety seats in cars, $73,000. Flammability standards in children's clothing were $220,000. Signal arms on school buses were $420,000 per life year saved. And flammability standards in children's clothing sizes were $15 million per life year saved. Recently, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, used a benchmark of spending $9 million per life saved in making decisions about how much to invest in different environmental programs. Since they're a public entity, we're effectively putting a price on life already. This is both good and necessary if we're to even out spending across life-saving efforts. While we should of course save all lives that we reasonably can, medical resources are limited and inevitably choices must be made. These choices should be made as rationally and consistently as possible to help as many people as possible to live as long as possible as soon as possible. However, huge variance remains. At the other end of the spectrum, consider insecticide-treated mosquito nets for the prevention of malaria. Malaria kills about 1,100 people a day. 70% of these are children under the age of 5. It's also the #1 killer of pregnant women. The organization GiveWell estimates that the cost per child life saved by the Against Malaria Foundation using these nets is just $3,340. And since those lives are disproportionately those of children, the cost per life year extended is even more economical. It's surprising that these statistics are so infrequently updated, so seldom seen and used in public life, and most of all, that they remain so divergent. Over time, regional and global governments and NGOs will grapple with these enormous differences. Why spend $9 million per life in some areas and $3,000 per life, 3,000 times less, in others? We'll recognize that it's ethically unsupportable to suggest that some human lives are worth more than others, and will increasingly track and manage HLE and bring life-extending efforts into closer alignment across groups as one of society's top priorities. So in summary, how will societies change as human life expectancy increases? Population will increase, but by less than you might think, and it will definitely get older. There's the prospect of increased conflict between the young and the old, men versus women, and those who have been genetically modified versus those who have not. And over time, increasing awareness of the existential issues facing humanity will cause our governments to become more global and better able to represent the needs of all people, including future generations and species. It'll also cause them to increasingly adopt the objective of lengthening HLE and enact policies that will realize it over time. In our next video, we'll explore potential economic impacts of living longer. In the meantime, please hit the like button below, subscribe to the Human Life Expectancy channel to make sure you don't miss our next videos, and post comments for the topics you'd like to have us cover. Thanks for joining us. Till next time, as we say at Human Life Expectancy Inc., Hi Hua! Please, do what you can to help yourself and help us all to live longer.